The morning of the wedding, the candles in St. Crispin's church had been burning since dawn. There were 40 of them, arranged in pairs along the nave, and their light fell in wavering columns across the stone floor, across the pale faces of the assembled guests, across the white gloves of the two Miss Vanes as they stood together in the small room behind the vestry door. The elder, Miss Cecily Vane, was the one wearing the veil. Her hands did not shake. That was what her sister Dorothea noticed first, and what she would remember longest. Not the beauty of Cecily's borrowed pearls, not the faint scent of orange blossom threaded through her hair, but the absolute stillness of those hands, and what that stillness meant. The Viscount Ashmore had proposed to Cecily in October. By December, the settlements had been signed. In January, 3 weeks before the wedding date, Cecily had arrived at Dorothea's door in the small hours, her hair undone, and her face the color of chalk, and she had said, very quietly, that she could not do it. She had said his name only once, and the word came out of her as if she were afraid to drop it. She had not explained further. She had not needed to. Dorothea had held her sister's cold hands in both of hers, and she had felt the whole weight of what Cecily was carrying, and she had not looked away from it. What she had said in the silence that followed was that she would go in Cecily's place, that the veil was long enough, that the guests would not be near enough to distinguish them, and the Viscount had met Cecily only in company, 3 times across the length of a drawing-room. She had said these things in the calm, practical voice she had learned to use in the 12 months since their father's death, when there had been no one else to manage the solicitor's letters or to explain to the household why certain economies must be made. Cecily had looked at her for a long time. Then she had said the words quietly. "Thea, he will know." "He will not," Dorothea had said. "Not today. And today is all that is required." She had believed it, in January. She had not thought very clearly about what came after. So there they stood, in the room behind the vestry, the candles burning beyond the door, the organ just beginning the processional, and Cecily was lifting the veil from her own face and setting it over Dorothea's head. Her hands were careful. She did not weep. Neither did Dorothea, because one of them had to be steady, and it had always fallen to her to be steady, and she did not yet know what a long and particular cost that habit would extract. The ring was a simple band of gold that had belonged to the Viscount's mother. Cecily placed it in Dorothea's palm. It was cold. Only the priest must say the vows, Dorothea said nearly to herself. And it was in that moment, stepping through the vestry door into the candlelit nave, that she first saw him. He was standing at the altar with his back to the congregation, in a coat the color of night, his shoulders very straight. He did not turn when the doors opened. She watched him for the full length of the aisle, 27 steps, and she counted each one because she needed something to count, and she thought that he was very still. She thought that this was a man who had learned to stand still under weight. She thought nothing else, because she had arrived at his side. He turned then. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of frost on a window before the sun reaches it. They moved across her face with a quality of attention she had not anticipated, a steadiness that was not the mere courtesy of a bridegroom. And she felt, in the small space of that look, the first premonition of what was coming. The priest, Father Mallory, was a small, careful man of perhaps 60 years, who had known the Vane family since Dorothea's christening. He had known her face for 23 years. He would know it again now, even under a veil. She watched his eyes change. It was not dramatic. His expression did not alter, and his voice did not falter when he began the service. And nothing in his posture communicated anything to the assembled 40 guests in the pews. Only a single stillness, lasting perhaps 2 seconds before he found her eyes and held them with a look she could not name precisely, except that it was weighted and specific. It said that he saw her, not Cecily. Her. Dorothea did not look away. She held his gaze for as long as it took her to understand that he would say nothing. Not today. Today was the text, the vows, the ring. Today was the candles and the processional and the pen that would sign the register in her own hand, her own name, Miss Dorothea Vane, and not Cecily's. and she would discover later what that meant under the law. The Viscount's hand was warm when he placed the ring on her finger. She did not look up at him in that moment. She would wonder for months afterward whether she had been afraid to. If you have ever held your breath through a thing that could not be undone, stay close. Dorothea's story is only just beginning. The carriage that carried the new Viscountess Ashmore to Harwood Park was very comfortable and very quiet, and the Viscount rode alongside on horseback rather than inside it. Dorothea had not expected to be grateful for this. She was grateful for it. She had 3 days before anything was asked of her in private. She had calculated this during the signing of the register. In the same calm part of her mind that had managed the solicitor's letters and the household economies. 3 days of house party guests, of public dinners, of rooms full of people between herself, and a conversation she did not know how to have. She intended to use them. Harwood Park was larger than she had prepared herself for. The entrance hall had a ceiling that rose to a painted dome, and the portraits on either side of the main staircase were lit by lamps already burning as the carriage arrived, because the household had been waiting since noon. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, was a woman of 50, with a warm, appraising face, and she met Dorothea at the door, and took her hands and said, "My lady," with a warmth that felt entirely real, and Dorothea felt the title land in her chest like something she had not budgeted for. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at the dome and at the portraits and at the long corridor that extended beyond the main staircase, lit by candlesticks at intervals. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost vertiginous, that she had made herself mistress of a house she had never intended to enter, in a life she had never intended to claim, and that the register bore her name, written clearly in the ink she had pressed into the page herself. Whatever else was uncertain, that was not. She had signed her name steadily. She had noticed this even as she was doing it, in the particular way she had of observing her own actions from slightly outside them, when she was managing something that required her not to feel it yet. Her hand had not shaken. The pen had moved across the page with the same even pressure she had used on the solicitor's correspondence, on the household accounts, on the letters of condolence after her father's death that she had written because Cecily could not. She had looked at the ink drying, her surname sitting where Cecily's was meant to be, and she had thought, simply, that it was done, and that the time for thinking clearly about it had not yet arrived. The guests arrived at 6. There were 14 of them, friends of the Viscount's, several acquaintances of the Vane family, 2 aunts from the Vane side who had not been at the church, and Lady Stanhope, the Viscount's nearest female relation, who was his father's sister, and who wore her opinions in the set of her jaw and the elevation of her chin. She examined Dorothea with the careful, thorough attention of a person who has read a document and found a discrepancy she is deciding how to address. "You are taller than I expected," Lady Stanhope said, not unkindly. "Cecily was always described to me as quite slight." "I am not slight," Dorothea said, and smiled, because there was nothing else to do, and because the smile was true. She was not a person who performed composure she did not have. She was a person who had practiced, across a great many difficult months, the art of standing in a doorway and walking through it anyway. Lady Stanhope's eyes remained on her for a moment longer than courtesy required. "No," she said. "I see that. Dinner was served at 8. The Viscount sat at the head of the long table, and Dorothea at the foot, and across the distance of 30 feet and 14 dinner guests she watched him manage his company, with the same quality of stillness she had first noticed at the altar. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was quietly, and the person he addressed leaned in. He refilled no one's glass himself, but he noticed whose glass was empty before the footman did, and the slight tilt of his head was instruction enough. She had not expected this. She had not expected him to be competent at tenderness in small ways. It was a dangerous thing to notice. She noticed it anyway, the way she noticed everything, carefully and with the intention of understanding it. She noticed that the 2 aunts were treated with the same quiet attentiveness as his oldest friends, that the younger guests were introduced to the older ones without condescension, that no one at his table was permitted to feel invisible. She had managed households in difficulty, and she recognized the discipline of a man who had thought about rooms before he entered them. She recognized it because she did the same thing herself. After dinner, the company retired to the drawing room, and the Viscount came to stand beside her near the window, because it was his house and it was expected of him, and he said nothing for a long moment, which she found she did not mind. Then he said that she had been watching him all evening. "I have been watching the room," Dorothea said. "Yes," he said, "but mostly me." She turned to look at him fully for the first time at close quarters, and found that he was already looking at her with the same expression she had seen at the altar, that particular quality of attention, not confrontational but specific. As if she were a text he was reading carefully, because he intended to remember it. "I am told," she said carefully, "that you and my sister had little opportunity for private conversation before the wedding. We met 3 times, he said. "In company." Yes, a pause. "And I find," he said, "that I know very little about what you are thinking." She said that she was thinking that he noticed a great deal. He did not look away. "I always have," he said. "It is not always comfortable." She was saved from answering by the approach of Lady Stanhope, who arrived with a cup of tea she did not intend to drink, and a remark about the proportion of the windows that took the next 10 minutes to fully exhaust. The Viscount withdrew to attend to another guest. Dorothea watched him go and was aware with great precision of the distance between where he had been standing and where she was now. She was also aware that he had not used her name once in the course of their conversation. She did not know if he knew what her name was. Sid. She did not know if that was better or worse, and she turned the question over through the remainder of the evening without arriving at a conclusion which was unusual for her. She was generally a person who arrived at conclusions. The guest departed over the next 2 days. Lady Stanhope was last staying a full day longer than announced, and when she finally took her leave on the 4th morning, she held Dorothea's hand at the door and said that Harwood needed someone who did not require it to be easy. She said she hoped Dorothea understood what she had come to. "I am beginning to," Dorothea said. Lady Stanhope's grip tightened once, briefly. Then she was in the carriage, and the carriage was gone, and Dorothea was standing in the entrance hall of Harwood Park in the first morning of her real marriage with no buffer remaining. She had thought he might not come to her. She had thought he might go directly to his study, as he had done the morning before, and not emerge until luncheon. She had made no plan for this. She had not been able to. He found her in the library instead. She was not hiding there precisely. She had gone to look at the spines of the books, which were arranged by subject, rather than by size, which told her something about him, and she was standing with her back to the door when she heard it open. She turned. He came into the room and closed the door behind him, and stood with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with the expression she was beginning to understand was simply his face, when he was thinking something he had not yet decided to say. "I should like," he said, "to speak with you." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her plainly that the ring she was wearing had been given to Cecily in December, and that when he placed it on her hand at the altar, he had known it was not Cecily's hand. The room did not change. The fire in the grate continued to burn. Dorothea did not move. "I have known your family since your father was alive," he said. "I knew your father. You have his hands. Cecily does not." She thought quite suddenly of Father Mallory. 2 people, she thought. 2 people had seen. "I do not," she said, "know how to explain this to you in a way that is not what it is." "I am not asking you to explain it yet," he said. "I am asking you to tell me if she is safe." Dorothea stared at him. "Cecily," he said, "she is the one I was not able to reach. I tried, in December. I asked if she was content with the arrangement. She said yes. I did not believe her, and I did not know how to press further without frightening her. And I made the worst choice available to me, which was to proceed." Something crossed his face that was not anger and was not grief, and was something between the two. A man looking at his own decision in daylight. "So, is she safe?" "She is with our cousin in Bath," Dorothea said. "She is safe." He turned away from her and went to stand at the window, and she watched his shoulders and the back of his neck and the line of his coat, and she thought that he had been frightened for Cecily. He had not married her. He had married the ring and the veil and the ceremony, knowing none of them were right, because he had decided that whatever Cecily was fleeing was something she needed to flee. And he had said nothing. She thought of her own silence on the altar steps, the same calculation made in the same direction from a different angle. "You let the ceremony proceed," she said, knowing. "Yes," he said, and turned back. "Did you think I did not know?" She had not known what she thought. She thought it now. "My lord," she said, and her voice was steady, because it always was, because steadiness was the only language she had ever been reliably fluent in. "I am not Cecily. You have married me instead of her, and the register bears my name, and I do not know what you wish to do with that." He looked at her for a long time. The fire shifted in the grate and sent a thread of light across the floor between them. "I have been told," he said at last, "that what I should wish to do is have it annulled. My solicitor would advise this. Lady Stanhope would also advise it, if I were to ask her." "Yes," Dorothea said. She said nothing. "You came to that altar," he said, "and signed your own name in the register, with a clear eye, and without pretense. You have spent 3 days managing this household and 14 guests and Lady Stanhope, who manages no one. You stood at my table and you watched me, and you did not pretend you were not watching." He paused. "I find that I am not in the habit of walking away from things simply because they did not arrive in the order I expected them." The pause that followed was the longest she had yet sustained, and she was a person accustomed to silences. "There are things," she said, carefully, "that I should tell you. About my own position, about what I was hoping to secure by this arrangement, and what I have perhaps taken from you without your consent. I know about the entail on your father's house," he said. "I know that your cousin inherits in March if no other arrangement is made. I knew this in October, before the proposal." She looked at him. "Cecily told me nothing of the kind," she said. "No," he said, "but your father did. Before he died, he asked me in his last weeks whether I would consider either of his daughters. He did not specify which. He asked me to determine that for myself." A pause. He was a man who said what he meant, and no more. I respected him. She felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with her father's handwriting on a page, a particular slant she had been reading since she was 8 years old. She did not speak. He did not press her to. He simply waited, with the same quality of stillness she had been mapping for 4 days, and she understood now that it was not coldness. It was the stillness of a man who has learned that waiting is a form of respect, that silence offered to a person in difficulty is something different from the silence of indifference. Perhaps this is the moment to tell you that Dorothea had not cried since the night her father died. She had managed things instead. It is a particular discipline, the redirecting of grief into function, and it works precisely until it stops working. It stopped working now. She did not weep noisily. She turned to the nearest shelf and steadied herself with one hand on the spine of a book she did not read the title of, and she pressed her other hand flat against her sternum, and she breathed, carefully, until the worst of it passed. He said nothing. He did not come to her, which was the right instinct, because she would not have been able to bear being managed in that moment. He simply remained in the room, present and quiet, which was its own kind of offer. When she had steadied herself, she turned back. Her eyes were damp, and she did not pretend otherwise. "He never told me he spoke to you," she said. "He would not have," he said. "He would have thought it was not his arrangement to announce." She thought of her father, who had always believed that other people's choices deserved room. "No," she said, "he would not have." The Viscount crossed the room, then not quickly, and he took the hand that was still extended toward the shelf, and he held it, not with any force, simply held it, his warm fingers around her cold ones, and he said her name. "Dorothea." Not Miss Vane. Dorothea, and the sound of it in his voice was something she had not prepared for, a thing that arrived in the chest, rather than in the ear. "I am asking you to stay." He had known it since the altar, she realized. He had known her name. The first snow came that night, early for February, and it fell past the library window while they talked for 4 hours, and the fire burned down to coals, and no one thought to rebuild it until quite late, and by then neither of them was cold. What was said in those 4 hours is not for the full record of this narration. Some things belong to two people and the room they are said in. And a library at Harwood Park in February snow is one such place. What can be said is that Dorothea told him about January, and about Cecily's face at her door, and about the weight of having been the sister who could manage things. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that she had carried it alone for longer than was reasonable, and that he intended to rectify this. And the way he said it was not a promise of rescue, but a statement of intent, plain and specific, the way a man speaks when he means to be held to something. She told him that she did not require rescue. He said he was aware of that. He said he was proposing something different from rescue. She asked what he was proposing. Precisely. A marriage. He said. The actual one this time. Between you and me, with full knowledge on both sides. She looked at him for a long time. The coals in the grate were very low. "You are an improbable man," she said. He said that he had been told. There was a small silence, not the kind that needs filling. The snow continued outside the window, steady and particular, and the last coal in the grate put out a brief pulse of warmth before settling, and she was aware, with her whole body, of exactly how close he was standing, and of the fact that he had not let go of her hand. She did not ask him to. In March, the letter to Bath was written in Dorothea's hand on Harwood stationery, with a seal that belonged to the Viscountess. It told Cecily that the entail on the family house had been addressed, that a secondary settlement had been arranged with the cousin by the Viscount's solicitor, and that Cecily's own portion, carefully preserved from the original marriage settlements, was entirely hers to manage as she chose. It told her that Dorothea was well. It told her in the most Dorothea-like sentence of the entire letter that she need not come to Harwood unless she wished to, and that there was a room for her whenever she did. Cecily's response arrived 2 weeks later. It was 3 lines. The third said that she had always known Dorothea was the better choice, and that she hoped the Viscount was beginning to understand it. He was. The thing about the Viscount of Ashmore, Dorothea had come to understand, was that he had been waiting, for some years, to stop performing the version of himself the world had decided to see. His wound was not a dead wife or a lost brother, though there was a brother lost, younger, 3 years back, in circumstances he described once on a cold evening in his study, speaking quietly into the fire rather than at her. He described it with great precision, and when he finished, he was silent for a long time. And she did not say that she was sorry, because sorry was not what the moment wanted. She said that she understood that kind of arithmetic, the particular calculation of loss that arrives before you have had time to prepare for it. He had looked at her then, turned his face fully toward her, and the look had been something new, a warmth in the gray eyes that had not been there before, or that she had not been close enough to see. It was something quieter than a dead brother that formed the heart of his wound. It was the long habit of a man who has held authority since 19, and who has found in the process that authority makes people stop looking at you with curiosity and start looking at you for direction, and who has missed, quietly and without spectacle, being seen as something other than a function. Dorothea looked at him with curiosity. She always had. She could not stop. He found it. He told her one evening in April when they were sitting in the garden after supper, unsettling and necessary in equal measure. She said that she understood the feeling entirely. He had reached for her hand then. On the garden bench, in the particular way that had become his habit, not claiming, simply present, his thumb across her knuckles in a slow, deliberate movement that her body registered before she did. She had learned not to look at her own hand when he did this, because looking made her lose the thread of whatever she was saying and she preferred to retain the thread. She did not always succeed. He noticed when she did not, and on those occasions something at the corner of his mouth shifted in a way that was almost, not quite, amusement. She had decided she would not remark on it, and so far she had not. But it was a close thing. The season came in May, and with it the question of London, and the question of what story would be told in drawing rooms about the new Viscountess Ashmore, who was, as more than one sharp-eyed acquaintance eventually recalled, the younger of the Vane sisters rather than the elder. The story was told in drawing rooms by Lady Stanhope. Dorothea did not know this until after the fact. She had not asked for it. Lady Stanhope was not a woman who asked for instructions before deciding something was right, and she had apparently decided, sometime in February, that the Viscountess Ashmore was exactly what Harwood wanted, and that anyone who had not arrived at this conclusion was behind her. She told the story plainly because she was plain by nature. Cecily Vane had been unable to proceed. Her sister had stepped forward, the Viscount had known, and the marriage was legal and recorded and entirely without flaw from a procedural standpoint, which she had confirmed herself with the family solicitor. She told it at 3 separate gatherings before the Viscount and Dorothea arrived in town, and by the time they appeared at Lady Hartfield's supper on the 14th of May, the drawing rooms had mostly made their peace with the particulars. Mostly. Lady Dunmore had not. Lady Dunmore was a woman whose confidence was organized around her certainty about what the correct order of things was, and the correct order, in her view, was that a man proposed to the woman he intended, and married the woman he proposed to, and what the Viscount of Ashmore had done, or allowed, or failed to prevent. She said this in Dorothea's hearing at Lady Hartfield's supper, during the interval between the second and third courses, in a voice calibrated to be audible to the 3 women nearest her rather than to the whole table. She said that the younger sister, under a veil, was not what any respectable family would present as a solution, and that one could not help but feel the Viscount had been rather too easily deceived. The table did not quite stop, but it slowed. To the room, Dorothea had become, in the weeks since the wedding, the sister who had managed something. It was not precisely a compliment. It was the kind of description the world applies to a woman when it cannot find a flattering category and refuses to invent one. Dorothea had been expecting something of this kind. She had dressed for it in a green gown, the color of deep water, that had not been retrimmed even once, because she could afford not to retrim things now. And this was still new enough to feel like something she noticed. She set down her fork. Because she had learned from her father that the body should be very still when something important is about to be said. "I would not describe Lord Ashmore as easily deceived," she said. Her voice was level. It was the same voice that had managed the solicitor's letters. "He knew at the altar. He chose to proceed. I think that is rather the opposite of deception, Lady Dunmore." Lady Dunmore's expression shifted. "He knew," she said, "and it was not quite a question. He told me so himself," Dorothea said. "The morning after the wedding, in the library, he was very clear about it." The table was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to matter. "He knew," Lady Dunmore said again. And now it was definitely not a question. It was a recalibration, the sound of a woman's script not quite fitting the scene in front of her, the sentence she had prepared, discovering that the room had moved. Lady Stanhope from the far end of the table said in her most comfortable voice that Lord Ashmore had known the younger Miss Vane for some years through her father, and that she imagined the ceremony had merely confirmed what he had already determined for himself. She reached for her wine. She said he was not a man who required things presented in the expected order. The table settled. Lady Dunmore did not speak again on the subject. Dorothea picked up her fork. Across the table the Viscount had been listening. He had not spoken. He did not speak now. He simply looked at her with the expression she had been learning, across 4 months, to read accurately, and what it said was the same thing it had said on the Isle of St. Crispin's, rendered now without a veil between them. "There you are," not as he had hoped to find her, as he had already found her and decided, and not withdrawn. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to Lady Hartfield's other guests, because the fish course was arriving, and there were other conversations to attend to, and she was a practical woman. That night, in the carriage returning from Lady Hartfield's, he said that she had not needed him to speak. "No," she said, "I did not." "You have never needed me to speak," he said, in a tone that was not quite complaint and not quite admiration, and was something steadier than either. "I needed you to stay in the room," she said. "That is a different thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I intend to stay in the room," he said, "for the rest of my life, if you will permit it." She looked at him in the carriage lamp's warm, unsteady light. This improbable man who had known at the altar and said nothing, and offered her a library in February snow, and she thought of her father's hands on his letters. The particular slant she had known since she was 8, and she thought of Cecily safe in Bath with her portion and her quiet life. And she thought of 23 years of being the sister who managed things, and the feeling of a ring cold in the palm, and what it had cost, and what it had given. "You have my permission," she said. "Pa." He reached across the space between them, and took her hand in the particular way that was his. Unhurried and deliberate, his thumb across her knuckles, and she did not look at her hand, and she did not lose the thread of anything, because for the first time in a long while, there was only this to attend to, and nowhere else to be. The warmth of his hand was the same warmth she had felt through her glove on the altar steps, when the ring slid across her finger and the service ended, and the whole of her life rearranged itself around a decision she had made in January, without understanding what she was deciding. She had thought she was managing a problem. She had been doing something altogether different. In June, Father Mallory received a letter on Harwood Park stationery. It was brief. It told him that the Viscountess Ashmore had intended to visit the church in March, but that he had been away in the country, and so she was writing instead. It told him that she understood he had seen her at the altar, and said nothing, and that she had wondered, in the months since, what that choice had cost him. It told him that she was grateful beyond her capacity to express, and that she hoped he would forgive her for placing him in a position that required it. The final lines read as follows. She had been told by her husband, who was a man of some exactness, that the register was legal and binding as it stood, and that her name, her own name, the one she had signed clearly in the parish record, was the name that stood before the law. He had consulted 2 separate solicitors on the question. She believed he had enjoyed doing so. Father Mallory had known her since her christening. He read the letter twice, carefully, and then he set it on his desk and sat with it for a while. And something in his expression, if any of his parishioners had been there to see it, might have been described as quiet satisfaction. The particular pleasure of a person who has recognized something the rest of the room was not yet ready to name, and who has been present long enough to see it proved right. The letter from Cecily that summer was longer than 3 lines. It arrived on a Tuesday in July, and Dorothea read it in the garden while the Viscount sat nearby with a book he was not reading, because he rarely read in the garden. He used the garden for looking at things. She had come to understand. He was looking at the long grass at the edge of the lawn, and at the stone wall, and occasionally at her. With a patience he did not bother to conceal. Cecily was coming. In August, she wrote. She had met someone. A clergyman, a quiet man with a library of his own, and a habit of rearranging books by subject rather than by size, which Cecily had apparently found more compelling than any drawing room in Bath. She wrote that he did not require her to be easy to manage, and that she found this was what she had wanted all along, and had not had the word for. Dorothea read this and looked up at the garden, at the stone wall and the long grass, and at the Viscount, who was now looking directly at her with an expression of composed inquiry. "Good news," she said. It was not a question. He said nothing, only waited, which was his way, and which she had stopped finding unnerving sometime in March. She told them about Cecily. She told them about the clergyman, and the library, arranged by subject. She watched his face as she said it, the slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the thing that was almost amusement. He said that a library arranged by subject was a reasonable foundation for a life. She said she agreed. He said that she would know. He reached for her hand. Then there, on the bench in the summer garden, and the afternoon was warm, and the grass was long, and somewhere inside the house the piano, which had been left mid-phrase since a musical evening in June, was being played again by the housekeeper's daughter, who had asked permission to practice. The sound of it came through the open drawing-room window and across the garden. A melody resumed in the middle of a passage as though it had only paused to wait for the right moment. The ring on Dorothea's hand was her father's family seal, reset for her in February by the Viscount's own jeweler, because it had seemed right to him, and because he was a man who paid attention to what was right. She had not asked for it. She had noticed it on her finger one morning, and looked at him across the breakfast table. And he had looked back at her with the expression that meant, of course, and she had understood that he was not a man who explained what he meant to do before he did it. He was a man who did it, and then he waited, without apology, to see if she understood. She had understood. She wore the ring still. She would wear it the rest of her life, and the stone in it was dark green, the color of the deep water gown she had worn to Lady Hartfield's on the night she had spoken plainly to Lady Dunmore in front of a table full of witnesses, and the stone caught the afternoon light now and sent a small bright point across the garden wall there, and gone. Steady and returning, the way certainty sometimes arrives. Quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, when you are not looking for it, and you find it has been there all along. The cold ring placed in her palm on the morning of a January wedding. This one was warm. Thank you for staying until the end. If Dorothea's story found you, leave a word in the comments.